thank you. This was so perfect, I should say, and leads us to the final and probably, to some extent, contentious issue, Jews and Muslims in the academy, which relates to a question that was brought up in the first session. To what extent the conventions of the academic environment, or academic, let's call it academic environment, really changed the way we interpret the past and how we apply the past to present challenges. So go ahead, Emran El-Badawi and Aaron Hughes.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Samuelson. Thank you, everyone, for having me here today. And thank you also, Professor Reuven Firestone and Gabriel Reynolds, for really a fascinating set of talks. I've enjoyed everything today. It's my task now, of course, to introduce the next speaker, Professor Aaron Hughes. That is a very difficult and a tall glass of water to offer you at this, day, at this time of day. So I'll do my best. But anyway, so we have today, of course, Aaron Hughes and his paper on Jews and Muslims in the Academy today. And Professor Hughes is Philip S. Bernstein Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Rochester at the Department of Classics, Religion and Classics. He needs little introduction, not least given how prolific and how forceful and fearsome his output is. He received a BA from Edmonton, an MA and a PhD from Indiana University in Bloomington, and has many, many prestigious fellowships, awards, scholarships, grants, including those from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, prestigious residencies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, UC Santa Barbara, McMaster University, University of Calgary, and I could go on, but then I would just be speaking. We don't want that. His recent publications, and I had to, in fact, do research looking at, what I would describe as his CV. This was a difficult task, looking at, I think, more than 24 books. And I guess by way of looking at today's conference, focusing on Jews and Muslims, he has Shared Identities, Abrahamic Religions, The Texture of the Divine, Imagination and Medieval Islamic and Jewish Thought. I think this is based on his thesis. He's welcome to correct me. That was in 2004. He also has on The Uses and Abuses of History, 2012, Medieval and Modern Imaginings of Judeo-Islam in 2017, Muslim and Jew, Origins, Growth, Resentment, 2018. Very provocative title. Somewhere Between Islam and Judaism, Critical Reflections in 2021. So that's hot off the press. I could really go on forever, but we're all here, of course, to listen to Professor Hughes. And I, of course, want to know what is the potion and the elixir that he is drinking so he can produce so much. That's really why I'm here. I hand it over to you.
Should unmute myself. There we go. Thank you, Professor El-Badawi. I really appreciate your kind words. And I think what Hava said is that in many ways, my presentation, the backdrop against which everything that we've done today takes place. So I hope I can do it justice. So let me just begin by saying it's really a pleasure to be here virtually today, and I'm really honored to be in such esteemed company. And before I begin, I'd like to thank Professor Tirosh-Samuelson, my Dr. Mutter, for the kind invitation to join you all here today. There's a tremendous weight whenever I do something for Hava that goes back to when I was a graduate student, and it's really a pleasure to be joined by a number of friends and colleagues whom I have considerable respect for and whose work I've learned a great deal from over the years. I should probably add, and I think I'll echo some of the other comments, or at least introductory comments, is that I really hope these Zoom conferences and workshops will soon be a thing of the past, as they were once a thing of the future, and they will gradually give way to encounters in real time. I really miss the face-to-face encounters, and note that my mental and ocular health are increasingly losing patience with these virtual interactions. But as they say in the UK, needs must. And again, I would be remiss if I did not thank in advance Professor Emran El-Badawi for graciously agreeing to respond to my musings here this afternoon. I hope my words find favor in his eyes, and I look forward to hearing his thoughtful comments that will undoubtedly push some of my ideas in new and exciting directions. Okay, so with that in the background, I should perhaps state at the outset that though I've been asked to speak about Jews and Muslims in the academy today, it is far too broad a topic. Indeed, so broad that I'm not sure how one would even be able to address it. And since I imagine this is an issue that many of us have faced with our rubrics today, I've taken the liberty of trying to whittle it down somewhat. I cannot, nor would I even be so bold as to think I could address such a large constituency as, quote unquote, the academy today, let alone in the context of a 30-minute talk. Now, there are many Jews and many Muslims who inhabit positions in departments across the length and breadth of the humanities, social sciences, engineering, and medicine, some of whom will inevitably be Zionists, some of whom will inevitably be critical of Israel, just as there will be other Jewish and Muslim academicians who will feel passionately about the conflict in the Middle East. I'm sure that there are some Jews, or perhaps even many Jews and Muslims in the academy, that could care less. But I do think we can safely say that in the academy, in whatever field or discipline, whenever Jewish and Muslim colleagues get together for whatever purpose, there is inevitably an elephant in the room, and that elephant is Israel. Even if not addressed, that country and all that it is either perceived to stand for or against resides in the background, boiling up as it inevitably does every now and then to the surface. So with that in mind, what I propose to do is talk, and I hope talk meaningfully about my own little academic turf, a turf that, while a little less anecdotal and I hope a little more structured from the more general rubric, might nonetheless prove to be of some analytic utility. I refer in general to the study of Jews and Judaism and Muslims and Islam as they take place in the humanities, but more particularly in the field of religious studies, the field which I call my academic home. Most of those who work in this field tend to work in discrete religions. For example, we witness the so-called Jewish scholar who studies Judaism, the so-called Muslim scholar who studies Islam, the so-called Buddhist scholar who studies Buddhism, and so on and so forth. Of course, it is not always this way, but we increasingly occupy space in an academy, and this is a point to which I will turn to shortly, where identity politics tend to reign supreme. This often means that conversations between Jewish scholars and Muslim scholars, at least in the context of religious studies, can be less forced or awkward than, say, two engineers or two medical professionals occupying the fields of engineering and medicine, respectively. Is a conversation, moreover, that is often sanctioned by the academic study of religion's own commitment to interfaith dialogue. Such an approach ought, at least ideally, to seek out commonalities and mutual understandings between the two traditions. Though I'm not sure that this should necessarily be the goal of scholarship, and I've written much to this effect, it is important that channels of communication be open, and just as importantly, and I'll echo what several other people have said here today, that we not resort to reifications of the quote unquote the Jew or quote unquote the Muslim. For example, hey Saul, tell us what the Jews think of X. Or Ahmed, how come Muslims always insist on doing Y or Z? Such generalizations where parts stand for wholes and vice versa get us nowhere and actually do more harm than good. In this talk this afternoon, I want to come at Jews and Muslims in the academy from a somewhat different angle. I want to argue that there should be ample opportunity to study Jews and Muslims historically and in the contemporary period. This rarely happens because of, one, the nature of our academic fields and subfields, which artificially structure what goes where, and two, issues that revolve around what I was initially going to title this lecture, the elephant in the room, to wit, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over there, and the other Israeli-Palestinian conflict that occurs over here in classrooms and on campuses. Before I do this, however, allow me a few introductory remarks that reveal the possibilities, but also simultaneously expose the problems of cooperation. This means moving back and forth between certain aspects of the two traditions on the one hand, while on the other, paying attention to the ways that the fields of Jewish studies and Islamic studies construct their data. The study of these two traditions, perhaps not unlike the traditions themselves, was forged under the same crucible. Medieval Hebrew grammarians and philosophers, as we've seen in some of the comments in previous lectures today, use the same tools, terms, and categories that their Arab and Muslim counterparts developed. Whether they did this intimately or remotely is a matter of some debate, but it certainly cannot be gainsaid that it was contact with Islam and Muslims that gave Jews a new way to mine the depths of, to think anew about their tradition. A partial list of names should suffice to show the fruits of this contact. Avraham ibn Ezra, Moshe ibn Ezra, Shlomo ibn Gabarol, Judah Halevi, Bachi ibn Pakuda, Avraham bar Hia, and of course Maimonides. Such figures gave us medieval poetry, theology, mathematics, and philosophy. And they all did so, moreover, by adopting Arab and Arabo-Muslim forms to Judaism. Islam, in some, altered Judaism's DNA. Judaism, quite literally, would not be what it is today without this contact. In like manner, Islam would not be what it is today if it did not emerge from an environment that was saturated with monotheistic categories supplied by Judaism, categories like creation, revelation, and redemption. This is certainly not to say that the borrowing is simple and moves in one direction. Social theory has taught us far too much to hold on to such outmoded notions. These are two traditions that have thought a lot about the other to think about themselves, and of course, vice versa. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we witness all those engaged in the modern academic study of Judaism, then called Wissenschaft des Judentum, engage in similar academic tools used by European Orientalists to understand Islam. We witness the use of historical modeling, the creation of critical editions of texts, and a scholarly infatuation with another time, another place, and another people. But if for German scholars, this infatuation was directed towards the perceived greatness and Hochkultur of ancient Greece, for German Jewish scholars, it was Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, and the heights to which Jews aspired under the orbit of Islam. It was not simply a scholarly enterprise, however. Much energy went into creating the myth of Sepharad. We thus see the rise of Moorish architecture and synagogues, of Sephardic liturgy, and so on and so forth. In these comparative constructions, though, we witness the seeds of where we are today, I think. Jewish scholars were very much interested in Islam as a way to better understand themselves, Judaism, and Jewish history. Certainly their constructions of Islam were problematic, filtered as they inevitably were through a set of positive or negative need, whatever best fit their frameworks. Non-Jewish Orientalists, however, were rarely interested in Jews or Judaism, at least Jews or Judaism post-Jesus. This, it seems to me, is a real problem that is largely carried into the present, albeit under a different guise. Well, I shall discuss this more in just a minute. Allow me to state up front that all of us who work in medieval Judaism, at least on the Sephardic side of things, continue to learn the languages, cultures, and histories of medieval Islam. However, those working in medieval Islam are unfortunately rarely, if ever, interested in those Jewish communities who lived under Islam's orbit. Hebrew or even Judeo-Arabic, for example, are rarely seen as languages of Islamic studies. In like manner, there is very little interest in trying to understand how certain Arabic, Muslim, Arabo-Muslim ideas made their way into these Jewish communities, and in trying to understand and appreciate the various permutations that they underwent in this new environment. So just as we need the study of Muslims to enrich our understandings of certain aspects of Judaism, we also need Jews to enrich our understanding of medieval, and I might even add to this, modern Islam. The latter rarely happens, however, and I'm not sure why this is the case. Perhaps it was an account of the excesses of an earlier generation of Orientalists that always thought Islam was unoriginal and that everything in Islam could be traced to an earlier monotheistic source. But before I address some of these issues more expansively, allow me to recapitulate briefly with an eye towards problematizing the matter. Given the history of these two traditions, on the one hand, something that stretches back to the 7th century Arabian Peninsula, and on the other, given the history of the scholarly traditions used to study them, one would think they would be naturally affiliated in the academy. Unfortunately, this is rarely the case, at least in the current moment. Identity politics, criticism of Orientalism, Israel and the larger conflict in the Middle East, and a growing disinterest in textual traditions have all worked to create a barren terrain between the two scholarly traditions, just as the current political situation has done for the two religious traditions. Instead of engaging in historical and textual critical work on the intersections between Jews and Muslims, Judaism and Islam, we want to see interfaith dialogue. Indeed, the very manufacture of a category, so-called Abrahamic religions, is an attempt to do precisely this, something that often emphasizes platitudes at the expense of actual interactions. If one does work on the two traditions today in the academy, it tends to be done from the side of Jewish studies. I think everyone presenting today has a endowed chair professorship in Jewish studies. Those of us in Jewish studies who regularly work in Islamic studies, actually, that didn't come out right. Those of us in Jewish studies regularly work in Islamic studies to understand, for example, Moses ibn Ezra's relationship to the Arabic poetic tradition, Sa'adi Gaon's to Muslim Kalam or the Islamic theological tradition, or Moses Maimonides to Falsafa or the Islamic philosophical tradition. Very few, if any, however, work in the other direction. That is, very few people working in Islamic studies, unless they happen to be Jewish, are interested in Jewish poets or thinkers. I think, for example, of Bernard Lewis's work on Shlomo ibn Gabirol, or David, if Shlomo ibn Gabirol's Keter Malchut, or David Power's work on sonship and inheritance in the Quran. I really think this is an unfortunate state of affairs, and I'm not sure why it is necessarily the case. Why, as I asked earlier, is Judeo-Arabic or Judeo-Persian, let alone Hebrew, not a language of Islamic studies or languages that people,
their placement within their academic units, and that does have an imprint. And of course, it does. A lot of this does go back to the effective history of Lewis and Said. And I'll tell you personally, I love Said, but I do feel sometimes his argument, the book that he wrote was so powerful, and it was to the point that it was offensive. I mean, my own training and my own work, it makes me an Orientalist and someone who is predatory, according to much of his work. He softened that later on, but so there's a lot of work to do, and I think that especially within religious studies, where method and social science is a little bit more complicated, I trust the words of Professor Hughes.
Thank you.
I think. Oh, are we done?
No, do we have other questions that you would like to refer to? I would like to bring in some of the other participants, namely the presenters and responders, if they would like to help here with this discussion. I see a questions from Lior. Lior, would you like to share your point, which is currently in the chat?
Oh.
Is Lior with us, or did he's no longer with us? I cannot see everybody. Let me see. No, I don't see him here. But if anybody else would like to, get into this conversation from whatever perspective you would like to suggest, now I think is a good time to do it, and then we will wrap it up. Mark and Eve, some of the issues that were raised in this session actually pertain very much to the material that you study. Maybe that could help us to kind of see where the conversation is in the academy. Are things as bad from your perspective, or perhaps not as bad?
Well, I won't answer that directly, but I would like to thank both Professor Hughes and Professor El-Badawi for a very interesting discussion, which I enjoyed listening to. And I guess one thing I will just say is that I think we are starting to see a lot more cross-pollination on all sides. In my own immediate field, certainly, medieval social cultural history of the Middle East, there is much greater integration happening and comparative work happening between Geniza scholars and scholars who work on Arabic papyrology, as well as social historians in general. So I think the outlook is very hopeful. Yeah.
Any other comments? Elisa, do we see anything else in the chat?
No, I think we're good.
We're good. Matthias, would you have any other comments? I don't know if Yaron is still here, but I actually had a question to you while you were talking. So I don't know if you would like to, since you're still with us, I would like to hear what you said, and then I'll pose a question to you.
Yeah, I don't really have any comment as such to the last discussion, other than to say that I think that, I think was Eve, what Eve was just saying in response to the discussion. I think, it is a field-specific discussion to some extent. I understand that the scholarly activism that Aaron was talking about, I think we do have that in the humanities more generally. But I do think that there's also that there is a distinction between religious studies, history, fields that area studies as such. So I think these dynamics work out differently in various fields. And I will also say that you could say the same thing about the integration of Jewish history, for example, into the broader field of European history. That simply by the virtue of Jews being a minority, Jewish historians certainly over the past few decades have come to almost dogmatically to emphasize context. We understand Jewish history always in context, which has its own pitfalls, because very often the context in the European case then just becomes basically the nation state, which raises its own set of questions. And at the same time, a lot of European historians are not really particularly interested in Jewish history. And Jews appear usually, if you talk about the Holocaust, yes, all of a sudden Jews make an appearance in European history, but not really before or after. So I think it is a much broader conversation. The famous elephant in the room, certainly in Jewish-Muslim relations, certainly is Israel, and that's true for the field of Jewish studies within the academy more generally. I think that's true. But yeah, I recognize some of the things that we just discussed also when I think about the field of Jewish studies more broadly, even beyond the Middle East or Jewish-Muslim relations.
Yeah, I think that we are kind of trapped in a certain way. On the one hand, we want to be scholars and do the scholarly work with integrity. On the other hand, we do have responsibility. I definitely preached for that toward the community. But once we move into the community, then all sorts of other considerations become relevant. And and you can say that the communal interest actually muddy the water or muddy the scholarly water. So we become too enmeshed in a certain sense in issues which are not exactly what Professor Hughes would like us to focus on, which is kind of scholarly analysis for its own sake, as opposed to for the sake of other issues which are really outside the scholarly conversation. So that's kind of the tension that we work with. Maybe Reuven, would you like to comment, since you are one of those scholars who actually try to do both, and you do both of them very well as a scholar and as a person who participates in communal conversation. Maybe you have a comment on that.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to balance, because I'm involved in kind of community activism at some level. Sometimes that causes some people to question my research or my objectivity in my research, right? Because that's sort of an association with that. But one has to make the separation. I don't have a lot to say. I think I enjoyed the presentations, the responses, and I'll leave it to you guys to work on this.
To work it out, sort out. So I think that, Emran, I see you still with us. Would you like to say anything to our presenters and responders?
Maybe a couple of things. First, I just really appreciate today. It's just amazing to me. This is an area that I really knew very little about, and the way each and every one of the presenters and respondents imparted knowledge in this area was just so organized and so kind of easy to understand. And all of you must be just fantastic teachers. So you did a great job today. I wanted to make one comment maybe about the virtual nature, because that's come up a couple of times, and just in my mind, it's a kind of a balancing, because there is so much benefit just speaking from the community, and by the community I mean this world that we live in. There is so much benefit from having something like this virtual, because so many it just expands the horizon of people who can get the benefit of what is presented, and to a certain extent, I think, makes it a lot easier on the presenters, that instead of schlepping from Madrid to Phoenix, taking a day to get there, a day to recover, a day to participate, and then another day to schlep back and a day to recover. That's a big commitment. So on the other hand, getting people together, both from the standpoint of the presenters and having them have an opportunity to interact more easily, I think, among themselves. There's an enormous benefit to that. There's an enormous benefit, I think, to the ASU campus community, to have a number of scholars there to to discuss these kinds of issues, and enormous benefit to allowing some interaction with the community. But in my mind, there's no easy answer to that, and maybe it's a question of mix of programming going forward.
Yeah, appreciate it. We have a comment in the chat from a person, I believe it's Seamus Martin, who is in England. He says, I completely agree about the benefits of the virtual. I'm attending from Greater Manchester in England, and attending in person would not have been possible for me. So here you go. It's a confirmation and affirmation of what you just said. So I think if we do not have other... Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Probably as the senior person on this panel, now retired nearly a decade, when I was dealing with these issues in terms of the myth and the counter myth, I learned a tremendous amount from this. And thank you for inviting me to lead off this discussion. And I know some of the people who participated and spoke. I've met new people, and I figure a number of new friends. So thank you again for the effort that you have put into this, and to Lisa as well, who helped me with some of the technical issues that I'm not so familiar with, being one of the old folks in this virtual endeavor. So again, to all of the others as well, it was a good day.
Great, we appreciate that, and you have a good scope of the development of Jewish studies in America. When you started your career, the story was very different from where it is now. So it's it's interesting to see the entire arc of the scholarship that you've been doing in your particular area.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Thank you, Tamar Miller, for being with us for this entire conference, and your comments on the chat and on the Q&A function. And I think that on the whole, let me conclude this with an invitation to read more, learn more, be open to more conferences like this. And if you can all organize in your own institutions, things like that, I think that's the only way we can move forward. Otherwise, I agree, identity politics is going to consume all of us. So with this in mind, I wish you a very, very good evening. I don't know how late it is wherever you are. And thank you for taking an entire day to engage in this kind of conversation.